All right, well, why don't we get started with a little bit of an introduction? Hello, all. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. We're excited to have you all on today so that we can talk about the spongy moth, formerly known as LDD, formerly known as the gypsy moth. So you all know what we're talking about. We're excited to have Josh Halman on, who is the Forest Health Program Manager for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, and he's based in Essex Junction. I can't seem to talk today. I apologize. Just a few housekeeping things. You're welcome to keep your camera off or on. That's entirely up to you. We are recording this so that we can post it for those that aren't able to join us live. If you have any questions, I ask that you type them in the chat box and I'll relay those to Josh at the end of the presentation. And also please mute yourselves so that we don't have the background noise. Vermont Coverts is pleased to bring this program to you. If you've been enjoying these programs, please consider going to our website and making a donation so we can continue these. You can also sign up for our e-news there, which lets you know about these and other programs, both by Coverts and by many of our partners that will be of interest to you as a landowner. So let me tell you a little bit about Josh. He's originally from Michigan. He got his PhD from UVM in 2013 in natural resources, with a focus on tree physiology and ecology. After his postdoctoral work at UVM, he began working for the Forest, Parks, and Recreation Department here in Vermont in 2015. He coordinates a wide variety of projects, including annual maple health assessments, aerial forest health surveys, phenology monitoring, and insect outbreak monitoring and assistance, which is what he's going to talk to us about this afternoon. Or yeah, I guess it is afternoon, just afternoon. Anyway, let me turn it over to Josh, and we're looking forward to hearing all about the spongy moth. Thanks, Josh.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Appreciate the opportunity here. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment, and going to go through a number of slides about the kind of the history of spongy moth, the life cycle of the insect, as well as what outbreaks look like, what we're dealing with in Vermont right now, and then some steps that landowners can take to try and mitigate some of the problems associated with this insect. So just so you know, I'm gonna share this, but I'm also gonna turn off my camera since I'll be looking left at my screen the whole time. When it comes time for questions, I'll pop the camera back on so you can see my face. Thanks. All right. Okay. So everybody just holler if you have any issues with seeing the screen, but hopefully you're seeing the large screen here and not my notes.
It looks good, Josh.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So we'll get going here. What you're seeing here on this title slide, of course, is intact forest in Vermont, but some of the patches of red that you see there are defoliated patches associated with spongy moth in Vermont. And just to give a little background, so, you know, as Lisa mentioned at the outset here, the title for this talk originally was about LDD. And for those that aren't familiar with the name change at this point, you know, pretty recently we were still using the term gypsy moth for this insect, which is actually a racial slur to the Roma people of Europe. So because of that, the Entomological Society of America went through a whole name change process to find something that was descriptive of the insect, but was not offensive. And so they solicited information from a number of people to suggest names, and a committee there took it upon themselves to review those and determine what was the best fit. So in the interim period there, last year, you might have seen a lot of information where we were referring to this insect as LDD, which is basically just an abbreviation for its scientific name, Lymantria dispar, and the subspecies dispar. The name that the Entomological Society of America landed on was spongy moth, in large part because of what the egg masses of this insect look like. You can see that under this moth here, that it does kind of look a little spongy. And actually the name is pretty similar to what I believe French Canadians and the French use as well, which is spongius. So it's a similar name to an already existing common name. And that's what we'll be using for the duration here. That's the new common name for this moth. The history of this was that it is an invasive species. It was originally introduced into Massachusetts from Europe in 1869. by a scientist who was trying to develop a more hardy silkworm. And some of these caterpillars escaped, reproduced, and pretty quickly this became a major tree and forest pest in the region. And so to give you some ideas, it happened pretty quickly and people were pretty alarmed right at the outset. These are not spongy moths in the tree, of course, but this was an early control effort to rid the area of spongy moth, where people were climbing up in trees with these ladders. I think this was around 1905 or so in Massachusetts. And they were taking the tactic of removing as many egg masses as they possibly could from these trees. You can imagine that was quite a challenge to achieve that. And it wasn't 100% effective by any stretch. So over the years, there have been a variety of methods to try and control the insect, and we'll go through those today. But I did want to show you, this is a timeline from Massachusetts, just kind of showing how the insect has progressed in the Northeast United States and what steps have been taken. So I'm not going to pick this apart and go through every year that they mention here, but some notable things included the what you saw there with the removal of the egg masses from the trees. There were additional biocontrol efforts that were started to try and find some natural or biological method to either feed upon the caterpillars or parasitize those caterpillars. There's been quite a bit of work with that. One thing that was done, I believe in 1911, was the release of a fungus known as Entomophaga maimaga, which was the goal of which was to infect the caterpillars and reduce their populations. It really didn't take hold in 1911. But later on in the 1980s, there was kind of another almost accidental introduction of the fungus. And a few years after that actually happened, some effects of that began to be seen. And it was shown that that fungus was very capable of reducing caterpillar numbers. And at this point, I'll talk a little bit more about that fungus, but at this point, that's one of our major control species to reduce the population of spongy moth. But there have been other efforts, back in the 1950s when DDT was being sprayed all over, spongy moth was the target of a lot of those applications. Obviously, we're not doing that anymore, thank goodness. But there are still some insecticides out there on the market that are effective, that don't have the consequences of something like DDT. So we'll go through those as well. But kind of the thing to recognize here as well is that there's not really a way to fully eradicate this insect from our forests. It's here to stay. It functions on an outbreak cycle. So every 10 to 15 years or so, we may have an uptick in the species. But there are a number of biological controls in place to reduce those numbers, and a number of predators as well. So our hope is always that the outbreak is short, but we do expect outbreaks periodically in the region. I thought we could go just kind of walk through what the life cycle looks like for this insect. We always refer to it as spongy moth, but really the most destructive part of the life cycle is, of course, the caterpillar. And I'll walk us through kind of each stage of the spongy moth life here in a second here. But you can see that, relatively short period of time is taken up by that caterpillar phase of the insect. You can see it there on the bottom right. There's the caterpillar activity, which is defoliating the trees. Then these pupate and adults emerge. They mate, lay their eggs, and those eggs are deposited in these masses that you see on trees, and they last for many, many months. So from the end of the summer all the way until just about now, so early May. So let's take a look at some of these up close and get you familiar with those if you haven't seen those before. So the egg masses are what you're seeing here. They're these kind of tan colored masses that are deposited on the tree. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they look a little soft and spongy. When they're first laid, they're actually pretty firm. They're really packed in there with eggs. There can be 600 to 700 eggs per egg mass present there. And you can see the size of them compared to somebody's thumb there. We use these as a tool to kind of predict what the next year's defoliation likelihood is. So obviously the more egg masses, the greater the risk. And there's a series of thresholds that are pretty well established in scientific literature to tell you when you're at risk of major defoliation versus moderate versus light defoliation. But these are, what you can see throughout the fall, winter, and spring. When they're first laid, they're a little darker. And as the weather conditions go through the wintertime and into the spring, sometimes that color becomes a little more muted. There may be some disturbance to the egg masses themselves because of ice or even some predation, actually. But because there's so many eggs in these, if there is a remnant of an egg mass on a tree that was laid in the last year, there is the likelihood that there will be some caterpillars that hatch out of that. And what does that look like? Right here. So obviously an egg mass coated in these very, very small caterpillars. So when caterpillars are feeding and growing, they go through a number of changes in their size, and these are called instars. So this is the first instar that we're seeing of spongy moth here. And they look kind of cute right now, but they certainly balloon in size pretty quickly. But even at this small stage, these can actually have a pretty dramatic effect on foliage because of the timing of their emergence. As you might have seen in that last slide, we're looking at emergence, kind of mid to late May for the eggs to hatch and the caterpillars to come out. And as soon as they come out, they are looking for tissue to feed on. And at that point in time, most trees have broken bud and leaves have started to expand. Which are a really good target for these caterpillars, because as those leaves are expanding, the tissue is not as hardened off, and it's pretty soft tissue at that point. So it's an easy target for these caterpillars. And you can see here an image of those small instars feeding on oak foliage. Oak, especially at this stage when the caterpillars are small, is the preferred species for spongy moth, and it really is the preferred species throughout the life of the caterpillar. But as they grow in size and as their numbers increase as well, they become less selective for which species they actually feed upon. And you can find them feeding on a number of hardwoods, including poplars and maples. And when the numbers get high enough, pretty much anything that is around them. So this is kind of what most people think of when they hear of spongy moth, is this caterpillar here. So this is probably a third instar, maybe even later than that. It's much larger, obviously, than those first caterpillars we saw. But this is showing some of the real identifying features of the caterpillar. It's a hairy caterpillar, and always has these red and blue dots that are kind of lining the back of the caterpillar. And you can see some of the work that this particular one has done on the foliage. They're kind of messy feeders. They're trying to eat as much as they possibly can. So there's plenty of torn edges and that sort of thing on the foliage. This is just an image showing you one instar later. Those hairs are more pronounced. And there's a lot more caterpillars there, of course. And they continue to feed on whatever kind of foliage they can find at this point. There is the risk of conifers even being defoliated by this caterpillar when the population gets high enough. And in fact, in Vermont last year, we even had some reports of conifers that were defoliated by spongy moth. So the caterpillars feed on the leaves, and of course, the goal is to gain enough size that they'll be successful in turning into an adult. So this is what the pupal stage looks like. So once they have gone through all the instars, they pupate, and this looks really different than those caterpillars, of course. And I've had plenty of calls where folks think that there's some other insect that's around because this just looks so strange, but it really is. It is spongy moth, and they'll be in these pupal cases for around a month. And at the end of that time, adults emerge, and adults in this case, of course, are moths. And there's, as you would expect, male and female moths. What you see on the left here is an example of both a male and a female. The male is kind of the dustier colored one. The female is more white. And really the most the easiest distinction maybe between these two is that the males fly, and they fly like crazy. If you have a large number on your property or in an area that you're at, you will be inundated with them during an outbreak. However, the females don't fly. So when those pupal cases are present, you can expect that the females will be pretty close to where those cases actually are. And so the females emerge, they cling to the tree, and they're able to move on the tree, but they don't fly. The males seek them out, they mate, and then you can see in the right-hand photo here just how prolific the egg mass laying is with these females. So yeah, they can lay many eggs on even one particular tree. I've had some reports this year come in where some folks had upwards of 1,000 egg masses on one particular tree. So it can be very prolific. So that those eggs, of course, will stick around, and the whole cycle will repeat itself the following year, especially during an outbreak scenario. And to give you some context on what outbreaks look like in Vermont and how frequently we've had them, this is a chart just showing acres that were defoliated from spongy moth in Vermont over the years. And you can see that pretty early on in the 1900s, we had significant defoliation occurring. So basically, each one of these spikes indicates not only how many acres were defoliated, but indicates an outbreak event. And you can see that there is some periodicity there. The last one on our graph here is back in the 1990s. We did have some defoliation, I think around 2004 as well. That's not on this chart, but 1990 was the largest outbreak in recent memory. And that's what we've been comparing some of our numbers to from our egg mass surveys. And I'll show you that in a little bit. But one thing to remember with these kind of cyclical outbreaks is that there obviously have to be some controls to reduce those numbers of caterpillars and insects to the point where it's not a continuous outbreak for many years. You know, these outbreaks typically last between 3 and 6 years. And there are a number of species that can help reduce populations and bring that outbreak into control. So I'm going to go through a few of those right now. Some are more significant to the control of spongy moth, but kind of the point here is that there are a lot of species that take advantage of these outbreaks. So with that, I'll lead us into the first one, which is a parasitic wasp known as Catesia. And this attacks kind of early to mid instar larvae, and don't run into these that often, but they certainly are around. You can see it would be quite a bit of effort to attack one caterpillar, but they definitely have an impact when you have plenty of caterpillars around. But this is certainly not the dominant species that's keeping spongy moth under control. There's another parasitic fly, the species of which I don't have right now, but they actually parasitize the the caterpillars, and this kind of reddish thing that you see on the outside of this desiccated caterpillar is actually the pupa of that fly. That's kind of the textbook image that we see. The eggs from this fly are laid in the larva. They develop and hatch, and when they pupate on the outside of the caterpillar, and that's what you're seeing here. And obviously you can see that the caterpillar itself is no longer alive and is quite dry. Something that I've been noticing, and I mentioned to a number of folks already, is the presence of this parasitic wasp on egg masses. So this particular wasp focuses in on the egg stage of spongy moth and lays eggs in these and feeds on the eggs of the spongy moth as well. And as they're leaving the egg masses, you can kind of make out these tiny little holes that are in the egg masses. They're kind of the emergence holes of these parasitic wasps. So if you see some of these egg masses and you're seeing holes in there, that's a sign that this wasp was there and was feeding on spongy moth eggs. And It's a good thing. It certainly is. It reduces the number of viable eggs within an egg mass, but it kind of maxes out at 20 to 30% of the eggs from an egg mass. So it's not minuscule, but it certainly is not completely eradicating the risk of defoliation from that egg mass. The reason it can only effectively kill that many eggs per egg mass is simply because of how small this wasp is. It can't penetrate deep into the egg mass, so it's really getting those superficial eggs that are just under the outside coating there. But certainly still effective at reducing numbers. 20 to 30% could be a big number, actually, especially during an outbreak. This is kind of an interesting beetle known as Calisoma beetle. They feed both on caterpillars and pupae. It's kind of a gnarly image here, but this insect actually will roam up and down trees seeking out this food source. So they definitely capitalize on the outbreak status. And again, they're feeding on 2 stages of the insect here. So that's certainly helpful. Something that will attack 2 stages is likely to have a pretty good impact, perhaps on that tree. You know, this insect itself is the Calisoma beetle, that is not nearly as prolific as spongy moth, but the fact that they are targeting a couple different life stages is good news for control. Something else that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it actually does happen, is that mice actually do feed on pupa. And they target preferentially the female pupa because those actually wind up being larger than the males. And so it's a easy food source. You know, it's not moving away from the mice at all. But there is some evidence that they will capitalize on that and feed on the pupa. I bring this bird up. So this is a cuckoo species, and I'm guessing plenty of folks on this call know way more about birds than I do. But I know that some birds are very reluctant, is probably the wrong word, but they do not care to eat hairy caterpillars. Those hairs on the caterpillar can be, to humans can actually be a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Can cause a reaction in some people. There's similar species that have a much greater effect on humans, but those hairs can be irritating. And so there are a few species of birds that do still enjoy eating those caterpillars, and cuckoos are one of those species. I believe there's a list of other ones, and I think they're finding that more and more birds are known to eat these kinds of hairy caterpillars. But these cuckoos definitely will eat them and will help reduce populations to some degree. But now we're getting into kind of the 2 major controls for spongy moth that we have here in the Northeast. And the first that I'll talk about here is nuclear polyhedrosis virus, more commonly known as NPV. And this is a virus. We're all pretty well versed in how viruses function at this point. But this is an image of a caterpillar that was killed by this virus. And it's one of those viruses where the greater that the population builds, the more virus is present. So it's spread from one individual to the next. And so when you have the populations build, this virus becomes a bigger player in the outbreak itself. The way that you can tell if the caterpillars have been killed by this virus versus some other method is that when they die, they kind of form this upside down V. That's what this is showing here, which is pretty unique compared to some of the other ways in which the caterpillars are dying. So if you see desiccated caterpillars in an upside down V, the culprit really is NPV. And this can have a significant role on the population because, as I mentioned, it really is predicated upon an outbreak and population building. So it spreads quickly, and it spreads from one individual to the other. So the second thing that really does knock down the population and historically really keeps the insect under control is this fungus known as Entomophaga maimaga. So this was the thing I was talking about earlier that was introduced around 1911. And at that time when that was introduced, it really had no effect. They thought it was a total failure. And as I mentioned, I think in like 1985, it was reintroduced, and a few years after that, was found to have a really large impact on spongy moth caterpillars. The thought is that the introduction in 1911 may have just been poorly timed. It may have been a year in which there was not a lot of moisture around, which resulted in the fungus not being very effective. As you likely know, fungi need some moisture in order to be successful, and if it's going to be released when there's not enough moisture in the air or on the landscape, then the odds of it being effective are pretty low. So what we see now is that this fungus routinely is all around. This doesn't have any effect on humans, and it really targets this caterpillar primarily. And you can see that this caterpillar is very desiccated. Sometimes what you'll see is that a portion of the caterpillar will be attached to the tree, but maybe the top half is kind of leaning back from the tree. And that's a real textbook sign that the fungus has been activated. I'll mention this in a moment, but I'll bring up the fact that part of the reason that we think that we're in an outbreak right now is because this particular fungus was likely not very effective or active in 2021 because of the drought that we were going through. We had, as you know, pretty dry growing conditions from 2020 leading into the spring of 2021. And without any fungal activity, it really allowed the population of spongy moth to build up in the area. So I kind of spoke about host species earlier, but just wanted to reiterate that oak really are the preferred species for this insect. Sugar maple, of course, has been fed on and certainly was fed on last year in Vermont. Aspen species are also very susceptible to spongy moth outbreaks. And you can see this image at the bottom here as well, showing that conifers are not completely safe, especially in an outbreak situation. When the caterpillar numbers get high enough and their food source where they are presently is completely consumed by them, they need to move on to something else, and they will target conifer species and defoliate those. One thing that's important to point out is that healthy hardwood trees can often survive more than 1 year of complete defoliation. This is because they have carbohydrates stored. They store a lot of carbohydrates in the roots, and they're able to access that. And you may have seen even last year, some trees put out a second flush of leaves after being fully defoliated. So in that case, they were still able to capture carbon through photosynthesis and generate even more carbohydrates. So hardwoods have an edge here over conifers. Conifers, they store less of their carbohydrates in the roots than hardwoods. They store a lot of it in the stems and the needles themselves. And so one defoliation of conifers can pretty quickly kill the tree. So it does become a big problem when you have these outbreaks, that those folks with conifers that get defoliated are concerned about whether their tree will live or not. And my thought on it always is to, if you can, and it's safe to, give the tree a chance to come back the following year. It's not always guaranteed that it's going to kill the tree, but give it some time to see what happens the following spring. And if it's not growing back, then of course you might consider removing it. But conifers definitely suffer greater in terms of survivability and health when they're defoliated by spongy moth. So in addition, I guess the real question is, why do we care about this in the state? Especially for those that are living in a city or an area with a high population of spongy moth. The defoliation can be a nuisance in itself, but also the just presence of the caterpillar can be a really big nuisance. You probably saw plenty of news coverage last year about neighborhoods in Burlington and Colchester where the spongy moth activity was so high that there were leaf fragments everywhere, there were caterpillars everywhere, and there was frass or caterpillar poop all over the place, and it can be pretty nasty. And so people obviously get concerned about that when it's right on your property or at your home. in a broader context, of course, defoliation is important and concerning because it does reduce tree health and can cause either decline or mortality of species in the area. And as I mentioned earlier, carbohydrates get reduced in the trees. This reduces the ability of trees to defend themselves, reduces the ability of trees to grow. So it can be a pretty big effect on tree health. So wanted to bring up a recent outbreak in southern New England. So this was from about 2015 to 2017. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts all had a very severe spongy moth outbreak. This image is from 2016 from an aerial survey in Rhode Island, and this is in June. So you can see that there are some trees with foliage, but in large part, the whole landscape was pretty much defoliated from spongy moth. Here's another image. This is from the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts. Similar thing going on there. Lots of defoliation present. And one thing to note that separates these areas from Vermont is that these are largely oak-dominated forests. In Vermont, we certainly have plenty of oak stands, but it is not, the most common species on the landscape by any stretch. And we don't have these large areas of forests that are full oak forests like southern New England, but we do have areas like that in the state. It's just that it doesn't consume the entire state. So for instance, Rhode Island, the entire state was pretty much defoliated during that outbreak. Over, I think, close to 250,000 acres were defoliated. And in Massachusetts, over 900,000 acres were defoliated in 1 year from spongy moth. So huge effects in those states from that outbreak. And that kind of came to a close in 2018. We were spared during that outbreak, but as you know, we are currently in an outbreak in Vermont. And so I'm going to walk us through what that's looking like right now. This is an image actually from Colchester Pond showing defoliation last year in June. And yes, as you can see, it looks just like those other images where we're in the middle of summer, but the hardwood forest doesn't have any leaves on the trees. Show you a couple other images. This is from Moncton, Vermont. And I have to give credit to UVM Spatial Analysis Lab for the left images. They use their drone to capture some great footage of defoliation in the Champlain Valley last year. And you can see that this is a time series here, right? So June 14th on the top photo and June 23rd on the bottom. So just a little bit over a week, and quite a big difference in the leaf cover in that forest in Moncton. And I should note that is a mix of oak and I'm sorry, that's primarily sugar maple there. And you can see the sugar maple being fed on in the lower right image as well, with tons of caterpillars on there. Another image of that hillside from the road. So pretty dramatic effects. If you walk through a forest like this in the middle of summer, when they're feeding, certainly there is all that frass rain. There's lots of noise. There's lots of stuff coming down. And it feels pretty strange to not have a canopy above your head. So it's a little alarming when this happens. I showed a couple images from aircrafts, and of course we fly the state every year to map forest damage. And last year was no different. So this is a map from 2021 showing defoliation from spongy moth in Vermont. And you can see that it was really located in the Champlain Valley last year. That was the primary area. All these black areas are what we mapped from the plain as areas that were defoliated. So it kind of went right up to the foothills of the Green Mountains if you were going from west to east. And again, we think that the reason we had this much defoliation, which was nearly 51,000 acres being defoliated, was largely due to no activity of the fungus or the virus because of the drought. So we had this big uptick in defoliation, of course. The images you see at the bottom right are an image of egg masses. Like I mentioned, you could have hundreds to thousands on a tree. The image on the left there is actually, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but this is from up in Highgate. And this was later in the feeding season. So this is, and maybe I'm not sure I talked about the feeding window earlier, but the feeding window really is from late May until the very end of June or the first week of July. So this photo to the left is showing something in Highgate towards the end of that feeding window. And we are seeing some mortality of the caterpillars here. You can see some that are in that upside down V shape, some others that are desiccated. So that as the season went on, we did get some moisture, which helped kill some of the caterpillars, but certainly not enough to reduce defoliation that we mapped, or to really reduce the numbers of egg masses that were laid in the last year. So how do we know what's going to happen in subsequent years with an outbreak? Well, we monitor for spongy moth at a number of sites throughout the state. We have 9 long-term plots in place in Vermont that we've monitored, that the Forest Health Program has monitored since 1986. Most of these are located in the Champlain Valley. We have a few in southeastern Vermont as well. And that's because of a couple things. One, being that these are the areas that historically have had the most defoliation from spongy moth. And secondly, they are certainly oak-dominated forests. So the likelihood of spongy moth being there is higher than in other parts of the state. So we've monitored this since 1986. And the way that we monitor this is in the spring, we go and we wrap a tree in burlap. And I'll get into the details and the reasoning behind that in a moment here. But we wrap a tree in burlap, and in the fall, we come back and we count the number of egg masses, both under that burlap and on the tree itself. And the number of egg masses gives us an indication of what to expect for the following year's defoliation. So these are relatively small plots, about a 25th of an acre. But when we looked at our data, we obviously collected these data last fall in 2021. And the numbers of egg masses that we saw in our plots, that is, were the highest that we've seen since we began recording. So to give you an indication of what that looks like, the light green color on this map is exactly the same thing as that the previous map I showed you, the areas of defoliation. What's new here are these blue circles. The blue circles indicate our long-term monitoring plots. And the size of the circle indicates the numbers of egg masses that were present there. So the bigger, the more egg masses. We did some additional additional transects in the state as well to see if there were other areas that were hard hit. And the size of those green circles indicate where we found high numbers of egg masses as well. So just to give you an indication that we have quite a number there, and I'll show you the figure here for our long-term plots, looking at egg mass counts. So this is from 1986 up to the present. Average number of egg masses per plot is on your y-axis, and I'll direct your attention to that scale. It's a little counterintuitive. It's not just a 1, 2, 3, 4. You're making some pretty big jumps there because it's a logarithmic scale. So you have from 0.1 to 1, then to 10, and then to 100. So a little bit of movement on that y-axis means a big change in the numbers of egg masses. And so you can see in 2020, we had somewhere around 26 egg masses per plot on average. For 2021, we're looking at around 200 egg masses per plot on average. So quite a leap in the numbers of egg masses that are present in those plots in particular. Because of this, we put out some information towards the end of last year for landowners to know what's going on with the outbreak itself, and directed folks to some possibilities for treatment and or some mitigation that you could do yourself on your land. The website for this is down at the bottom there. It's still available. And what I wanted to do next is kind of talk through what you can kind of do on your property to help reduce the nuisance and or risk of spongy moth defoliation and tree decline. So there's a number of methods, and these have been around for quite a while, so it's not really very new stuff here, but I thought it might be wise to kind of go over some of these methods. These include removing egg masses, burlap banding trees, which I spoke about just a second ago, using sticky bands on trees, or treating with insecticides. So egg mass removal, as you would imagine, would ultimately kill the eggs. It's a good technique if you have just a couple trees in your yard that you're concerned about. and there's not heavy defoliation surrounding your property. Of course, the caterpillars are mobile, so if you are in an area where there's heavy defoliation going on or predicted, or if there's lots of forest with lots of egg masses around you, this might not really solve your problem. But if you are in a pretty isolated area without a lot of spongy moth egg masses surrounding you, removing the egg masses can be something that's helpful for the health of the tree and to reduce the nuisance on your property. So the real key here is to scrape off the egg masses, and I hope that chisel is not too sharp. I wouldn't want to damage the bark of the tree, but the goal here is scraping those egg masses off into soapy water, and soap is key here. That suffocates the eggs within the egg masses and will kill the eggs and not give them a chance to hatch. So that's something you can do on your property. But there are measures that are a little more effective if you have high numbers present. I just spoke about that burlap banding of trees, and so I wanted to kind of go through what that looks like. You can kind of see here there's a fold going on within that burlap, and the method here is to take a spool of burlap, wrap a piece of that around your tree, and then right through the kind of equator, if you will, of that burlap, tie a string, and then fold the top down over that string. And what that does is it creates this kind of shelter for the spongy moth caterpillars as they travel up and down the tree. One thing you can do as well is to cut a couple slits in the burlap for ease of flipping it over and finding the caterpillars. But really what this does is it creates an area where they can congregate and take shelter. What you'll want to do if you decide to do this on your property is inspect the burlap daily, and all the caterpillars that you find there, pluck them off and pop them into soapy water until they're dead. Similar to those egg masses, the soapy water will kill the caterpillars. And once they're dead, you can dispose of them in your trash or however you want to dispose of them. They're no longer alive, of course. So that is one effective method at trapping them. It does obviously require some attention because you're visiting these daily and having to drop them in soapy water and carry that around. But it definitely can help reduce the numbers on those particular trees. Another thing that is somewhat popular, depending where you are, is using what's called a sticky band with the tree. The name is pretty self-explanatory there. There's some that are commercially available, but you can make them yourself using duct tape. You wrap the tree and then coat it in a product like Tanglefoot. I think folks have used Vaseline in the past, things like that. Something that as the caterpillars move up and down the tree, which they will do, despite them feeding at the top of the tree, they do move down onto the bole of the tree and congregate often at night to try and get some warmth as well. So there is movement there, and that intercepts those caterpillars and obviously has them stuck there. There are some disadvantages to this, though. It can damage the tree bark if the material you're using does drip off that duct tape or that band. And perhaps more importantly, it can have effects on other species like birds, maybe other non-target moths and that sort of thing would fly into there and get stuck. So one option is to wrap like chicken wire around that to avoid that. But the other problem is that it's frankly just kind of messy. It can be effective, but there are some drawbacks to it. And burlap, if you have the time to use that method to pop them into soapy water, is just as effective as this. And the final thing I'll talk about for treatment is this product known as BTK. This is a biological insecticide, and certainly many people have issues with using pesticides in general. So this is not for everybody. But this is a biological insecticide. It's bacterial based. And there are even products out there that are certified organic. And the way that this particular insecticide works is that the material is sprayed onto leaves, and it's not effective unless the caterpillar eats. So there has to be some level of defoliation that occurs for this to be effective because the caterpillar has to consume it. But the benefit of that is that there's no topical issues with it. So coming into contact with it is not like coming into contact with, an acid or something like that that would burn skin. And there's no risk to humans in terms of inhalation. So that there are certainly benefits for using this compared to other insecticides. What the mode of action with this is that once the caterpillar eats this, it really disrupts their digestion, and it forces the caterpillar to not want to eat anymore. And in so doing, starves the caterpillar, and the caterpillars wind up dying. So as I mentioned, it's possible to have some skin or eye reaction to this. So if you are deciding to treat with this chemical, it's best to follow the label on the product and take the proper precautions and use PPE so that you don't have anything like that. But it does not have a risk for inhalation or any strong side effects for humans. In terms of how to apply this, really there's kind of two methods. One is the small scale, which is treating individual trees. You can hire a certified pesticide applicator to do this work for you, spray it up into the canopy of the trees. For larger parcels, there is an option for aerial applications from plane spraying this. The Agency of Agriculture is the entity that is responsible for granting those permits. And for this year, that window is closed. We provided information on how to go that route back in December, and needed to close that window for aerial treatment permitting by the middle of March in order for applicators to have enough time to get the proper maps and that sort of thing. If those are options that are of interest to you, I would recommend going to the Forest Health website that was linked earlier, and I'll share the link again here in a second, to find that leaflet that we created for spongy moth last year. It gives some information on the timing of it, who to contact, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully we have some reduction in activity this year because of the fungus and the virus. But if it does look like we are going to have defoliation again in 2023, and you're considering that, that's the place to go to reference that. So those are the treatment methods I wanted to talk about, and I just kind of wanted to sum up here before I take some questions. So bottom line, we had a lot more egg masses this year than the previous year. And so despite the good wet weather currently present, and the likelihood that there's going to be elevated fungal and viral activity on the caterpillars, we are expecting defoliation by spongy moth in Vermont again this year. We are in the middle of what's known as an outbreak, but this will come to an end. It can feel a little demoralizing and like you're in a horror movie here, but this outbreak will end. We shared a number of those predators and parasitoids of the caterpillars today. So you can see that there are a number of things that take advantage of these numbers and try and reduce those caterpillar numbers as well. So this will come to an end in a year or two. Provided some information on treatment methods, of course, and something that I just wanted to bring up here at the very end is that try and just be good to your trees if you're trying to protect them from defoliation and ensure that they make it through this outbreak. And one thing that you can do that's really important is to make sure your trees are well watered. Right now we're at a good place throughout most of the state in terms of water levels, but if we're having dry conditions throughout the state, it's a good idea to get some water on the trees that you're caring about. Obviously, if you're just concerned with a woodlot or something like that, you can't go and water the whole woodlot. But if you have some shade trees that you're concerned about, watering them is a really good method to ensure that the tree is just healthy enough to make it through this. We recommend waiting on fertilizer until the fall. It can kind of reduce the carbohydrate reserves within trees if you are fertilizing in the summer and they're trying to put out new growth while being defoliated, while putting out even a second flush of leaves. It can kind of throw the tree off balance. So fertilizing is probably a better idea later in the fall. But just try and take care of your trees. If you have bad conditions where the tree's growing, if there's root girdling or that sort of thing, you want to try and ameliorate that and give your trees a better chance of making it through this outbreak. Here's a couple other resources I wanted to share. VT Invasives is a great resource, has a lot of information on what I just talked about, as well as a host of other invasive species that may be of concern to you. And the Forest Health link up above for FPR has links to both that spongy moth leaflet. And if you want more information on BTK, you can follow links there to information we have on forest tent caterpillar, which is a native defoliator that we had an outbreak from a few years back. And associated with those files is a big FAQ about BTK. So I direct you to those if you want some more information. But from there, I will take any questions.
Great, Josh. Thanks so much. That was great. We have a few questions in the chat box. One comes from a landowner in Montpelier, wondering when LDDs or spongy moths are likely to hatch there. Is it different from the valley, like many other things, phenologically?
Yeah. So kind of the metric that folks use to predict when things are going to hatch is growing degree days. And growing degree days are basically a measure of how much heat you've accumulated throughout the spring and throughout the year. The valley is certainly a little earlier than Montpelier. We're expecting hatch to kind of start in late May here in the valley. I think we had our first reports of defoliation up in Swanton the first week of June last year. So I would expect early June is when you'd probably see them hatching in Montpelier.
Great. And Andrea wants to know, where are the pupae? Where do you find them? On the leaves, on the bark?
It's normally on the bark. And oftentimes, if you find an area that has heavy egg masses, you'll see those pupae on the bark as well. The moths, when they're when the caterpillars are pupating, they're trying to find kind of a sheltered area. So often what I wind up seeing is kind of on the underside of a limb that's coming out from a tree, you'll see a big number of both pupae and ultimately egg masses as well. So yes, certainly on the bark and oftentimes in kind of a sheltered area on the tree.
Okay, great. I know you addressed this during the talk, but it always bears repeating. The moisture, is there enough to activate that fungus this spring? What are our thoughts there? I know you kind of mentioned it, but
sure.
Pointed question.
Yes, it's hard to predict that. We don't have any method to really assess that annually like we do the egg masses and determining the population. But if you look at the U.S. Drought Monitor, we are now out of drought or even abnormally dry conditions throughout almost all of the state. I think there's a small area in the kingdom that is still abnormally dry, but that amount of moisture should allow the fungus to be active. The challenge is always, right when things are hatching is when it's most important. We have things set up right now for it to be successful and to be active, but how active it will be will depend on the growing conditions as the caterpillars are hatching, as they're going through their instars. So if we have another dry period there, I'd expect there to be some fungal activity, but maybe not as elevated as if we were having rain.
Yeah, like this beautiful weather that's coming next week, we're all excited for.
I know.
May not be so great for the fungus.
I don't think I've ever been so upset about having a week of dry weather. I just wanted to rain the whole time.
Jeff was wondering, if we don't see egg masses on a particular tree, is that tree safe?
Great question. Not necessarily. So as I mentioned, these caterpillars are mobile. So they could be hatching on a neighboring tree or even a neighboring woodlot. And one method for their movement, in addition to, as you would imagine, just crawling around, eating and crawling up and down trees, they can do this thing called ballooning, where some of the silk from the caterpillar, they almost use like a zip line, and they can go from tree to tree that way. So even if you don't have egg masses, if you're in an area that does have egg masses, that tree could possibly get defoliated.
Okay. Jeff was wondering if it's too early to treat trees now, to set up the burlap or.
Good question. So the spraying, if you were going to go the route of insecticides, it is too early. You have to wait for those early instars of the caterpillar to be present, and leaf material, of course, to be present for it to be effective. However, the banding, it's a great time to set those up right now, especially the burlap bands. We've put the burlap out on our monitoring plots already, so it's definitely a great time to start that kind of effort.
Great. We have a few people who mentioned that they did try the burlap method and it was very successful for them where
Awesome.
they did it. Some other people noted that they had ornamental fruit trees also that also were hit by the gypsy moth.
Yeah.
They like everything. I mean, when I found them eating, evergreens, I was like,
Yeah.
who knew?
Yeah. I think there's a few species that they rarely touch. I think, red maple has some chemicals within it that reduces the what's the word I'm looking for? They're not as tasty as some of the other leaves. So they try and they don't typically defoliate those trees. But yes, it is kind of remarkable the number of trees that they will attack.
Terry wants to know, can anyone buy BTK or do you have to be a certified pesticide applicator?
It's a good question. I think that there may be some BTK products at garden centers. The challenge, though, is that in order to get it to those areas of the tree where it would be effective, you're talking for mature trees, the top of the canopy. And in order to have the tools to apply a insecticide that far up in the canopy, you're probably looking at a certified pesticide applicator to actually do that kind of work for you.
Great. Dan wants to know, are there other caterpillars that reach large populations like the spongy moths?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mentioned at the very end there, the native defoliator we have here called forest tent caterpillar. And that was a big problem from 2016 to 2018 in north central and northeastern Vermont. I think combined, but for those 3 years, we had over, I think, 130,000 acres defoliated by that native defoliator. So they get in those big numbers as well. The treatment is very similar to what you do for spongy moth. BTK was the main insecticide that was used for those folks that decided to spray. But it looks very similar to spongy moth defoliation. Similar timing, similar number of caterpillars, similarly kind of gross to walk through the forest when they're feeding.
So when you hear the frass raining, people think they're hearing it munching. It's really just the frass raining, or is it both? I mean, can you actually hear them munching?
You're mostly hearing the frass coming down, especially if the canopy is well above your head. That's what's coming down. Yeah.
Does the burlap banding work for tent caterpillars? Was the question that just got punched in.
We haven't really used that method, and the forest tent caterpillars, they do come down, but we haven't really. It's a good question. I don't know that we've really tested it that much, or I haven't at least. I believe that they might not be quite as they might not travel quite as far vertically as the spongy moth do. They do come down to congregate oftentimes during cold weather, but yeah, it's a good question. I haven't approached that, but I'll look into that.
That sounds great. Let's see, one just got popped in, so we'll take this as a last question. Does FPR perform any treatment on their lands?
Good question. In the past, we have. Back in the 90s, we did. We have not decided to do any treatments this year for this current outbreak. The U.S. Forest Service would allow that kind of thing for some of the grant monies that they provide us. But at present, we expect that this outbreak is going to just be a couple years, and don't have an intention of treating at this point. It is something that we would have at our, we'd be able to do that if we wanted to, but right now we don't see areas of state land that are impacted to the level where we're concerned about mortality of trees, and that's where we would consider that kind of a treatment.
And one last quick question, because it's always been on everybody's mind when you talk about forests and changes and outbreaks and insects. What are we thinking climate change is going to do in terms of the gypsy moth and what we've seen since that, like that graph from 1980?
Sure. Yeah, well, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not a climatologist, but my understanding is that with the variable weather that's associated with climate change, that we may have these periods of kind of extreme weather events, right? So we may have periods where we're getting a lot of rain, but then we may be getting periods where we're having greater droughts and that sort of thing. And if we wind up experiencing greater droughts, then the biocontrols that are in place will not be as effective. So that's kind of a bigger picture, obviously, of how that could affect these kinds of outbreaks. I think the devil's in the details as always. So what does that kind of drought look like? Is it truly dry enough to reduce the fungal activity? That sort of thing. But if we do have more droughts, then the likelihood of more outbreaks is probably elevated.
All right. Oh, here's a good question. We'll finish with this one. I know I said that before, but I really like this one to finish with. Thank you, Cynthia. What makes the outbreak end? Or when do you consider it over?
That is a great question. So what makes it end is many of these controls that I was talking about. When the predators capitalize fully on the outbreak itself. So when the fungus is very active and killing thousands of caterpillars, if not millions of caterpillars, when the virus is taking hold as well, when some of the other parasitoids and predators that I mentioned in the talk have been very active, all those things taken together eventually overwhelm the population and reduce the insect's ability to reproduce to outbreak levels. So that's how that winds up ending. Was there a second part to that? I'm forgetting.
No, okay. Pretty much just when's it over?
So we'll know it's over because we monitor those egg masses. And when we see those egg mass numbers start to decline, we know that the reproduction is less and that the outbreak is coming to a close.
Wonderful. Well, Josh, thank you so much. There are a lot of kudos in the chat box thanking you for a great presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with us about the spongy moth and what we can expect and maybe what we can do as we move forward this spring. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye, all. Have a great afternoon.